for Anxiety and OCD, Episode 4. Today on the show, we are going to be talking to my good friend, Miss Jessica Huddleston. She is a licensed professional counselor and certified psychological assistant at Sabin Behavioral Health in Smyrna, Tennessee. She's going to talk a little bit about her own experience of having a child with OCD, as well as talk about professionally the importance of diagnosis. So let's dive right in. Okay, so just to start out, one of the things that I'm doing on the show is talking to different people with different viewpoints than instead of just going and interviewing all Christians, because I think it's important at times for people to seek the help that they need, and that may be outside the church or it may be outside the traditional Christian community setting. And so I'm curious for you, what is your kind of viewpoint on spirituality?
So I believe that everybody has some kind of spiritual power, and it's important for them to embrace it with whatever denomination or belief system that's important to them. But it's really just holding their own values and their own morals that is the bigger picture for me. And my goal as a clinician is to understand that person's values. So if that means that I need to be educated on it, so be it. I believe everybody's is a bit different, but being in the setting that I'm in, as well as being a counselor and my background being in clinical, I feel like it's important for me to not be biased and hold my personal opinions separately from whatever the clients are.
Right. Do you find it challenging at times to work with people that have a different viewpoint than you do?
No, most of the time it's just the goal is for me to understand what their belief systems are. And sometimes that takes me getting educated. Sometimes it takes the individual teaching me. Sometimes it's me going and reading things and figuring out and just having an understanding. And I'm very open to asking questions like, what does this mean if I don't understand, or why is this important? Things like that, because that having a common understanding is more important than anything that I particularly believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was to talk a little bit about your own experience in your family with OCD or anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, yeah, my son is 19 and he has difficulty with anxiety. My daughter, one of my daughters, has OCD, and we recognized it early on. She wasn't even 2 yet, and we were noticing some odd behaviors where she was collecting things and trying to hold things close to her. And when she was able to talk, she told us that she collected everything because she was afraid we wouldn't come back to the house. So every time we left, she wanted to have everything ready so she could take it with her. That included like garbage. I mean, like a candy wrapper or whatever. She would just collect everything. And we've spent a long time. She's 12 now, and we've spent a long time working on a lot of those issues. And she's doing a lot better, but it does come out with her schoolwork, her wanting to be very perfectionistic and afraid of making mistakes. And so her teachers have been really supportive of intentionally asking her questions that she doesn't know the answer to, and then they just praise her for trying, which has been a huge help. Luckily, she goes to a really supportive school. I do know that one of the things that I've run into professionally is a lot of parents feel stuck because the schools don't really understand their child's difficulty with OCD. And so I work really diligently to educate the parents so they can convey that information to the school, because a lot of times kids will come across as just being non-compliant, especially if they use avoidance as their tactic when they're overwhelmed with things. And so I think that's really important to me, to help parents have the vocabulary and the tools to be able to get their children what they need.
Right. I'm sure that advocacy process has been ongoing, because every year there's a new teacher and more educating that has to be done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some parents feel compelled to pull their kids out of school or homeschool them or do, now with everything going on, a lot of virtual schooling. right now with virtual schooling. That totally makes sense. But when parents want to take their kids out of school, I want to have a serious conversation with them about why and what the benefits are and what the drawbacks may be, because I don't think a lot of times parents realize that they might be helping their child for the moment and hurting them in the long run, especially with avoidance. It might be reinforcing their avoidance unintentionally. I mean, the parents aren't doing it because they want their kid to be avoidant. They're doing it because their kid is struggling and the school is complaining and all of that stuff. And it seems like a straightforward solution, but sometimes kids need to learn how to get through that struggle. And I really recognize that with my daughter early on, because on top of her having OCD, she had selective mutism, and that was difficult.
Yeah. Wow.
It wasn't at home though. It was only at school. So she would talk. We didn't know for the first year. She would talk at home nonstop about everything. Tell us everything that somebody did wrong at school, got out of line, all the stuff. But at school, she never said a word. And it wasn't until she got her finger stuck in a table at school and all the kids had gone inside and they realized they were missing one. They went back out and she was silently crying, and they called me and they're like, well, this happened. I'm like, oh, accidents happen. Kids stick their fingers in tables. Not a big deal. She's not seriously hurt. It's fine. And they're like, yeah, we just didn't know. She sat out there for about 5 minutes because she was so quiet. And I'm like, wait, what? And I was like, what do you mean she was quiet? And that's when they're like, yeah, she never talks at school. And I'm like, what? And that's when I realized she was at that point in kindergarten. She had gone there for pre-K for 2 years. And apparently the most she ever talked was a whisper, and nobody ever mentioned that.
Wow.
It's really strange. But once we figured it out, once we realized what was going on, we just started having her talk to strangers, talk to anybody, everybody. And she got out of that habit pretty quick.
So she was comfortable with talking to family members, and that didn't make her anxious. But when it was outside family members, she was really nervous to communicate to them.
Just anybody outside of, she would talk if somebody was close to her, like kind of if she felt like she had permission or if she felt safe, she would do it. So that's one of the, like, she talked to her teacher when we went to the parent teacher conference. So I didn't know it was happening until they're like, yeah, that I thought you knew, because she was always that way. They thought it was just something that it was an abnormality of her. And I was like, I guess it is. It's just not one that she presents everywhere, which is one of the things that clued us in very quickly to it, selective mutism. So
I wonder if it was really hard for you at times to push your daughter towards things that you knew were going to be good for her while seeing how much distress she was in.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody wants to see their child in pain, but when you know that it's the same thing as getting them to ride a bike or talk to a friend for the first time, you're sitting on pins and needles, it's hard for them, but it's good for them. We use a lot of positive self-talk, and trying to build that without it also becoming a compulsion is a bit of a trick, but that's one of the things that we figured out, of just reminding her, you've done this before, you've done things like this, you can do this. So, and I would only say it once, and then she would be expected to do. And one of the other things that I say that annoys her profusely is, you're fine. And so, you're fine, you can do this. And so it's been mostly challenging her. The more that we challenge her, the easier it gets, the less resistance I get. I found that what I've seen clinically is that parents that struggle to push their kids in the beginning, they get a lot more resistance. They have a lot more trouble with it. But afterwards, once they get kind of in a habit of pushing the kids to expand their horizons, they get better and it gets easier the more they do it.
Yeah. And the more that you start to face the things that you're afraid of, the more internal confidence that you develop. Right. And that carries you to the next exposure, so to speak, of the thing. That
right. And giving them the confidence to recognize that they just need to lean into the anxiety instead of backing away from it.
Okay. So you are a licensed professional counselor and also a certified psychological assistant.
Yep.
And so I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about your work environment and the kind of things that you do there.
Well, I have a lot of roles. I have a wonderful placard in my office that says I'm the vice president of miscellaneous stuff. So here at Save and Behavioral Health, I am the operations director, but I also do a lot of our intake interviews with the two psychologists that we have. We also do neuropsych testing. So we're often screening individuals for memory-related or cognitive-related changes or neurocognitive dysfunction, as well as just looking at general psychiatric-related difficulties and determining what course of action needs to be taken if they need to have a psychological evaluation or a neuropsychological evaluation, or if they are in the process or in need of therapy, those kinds of things. We see individuals from as young as 4 and as old as, in their 90s. We have had somebody that was 95, but we don't get that very often, but it does happen. We kind of run into a gamut of different difficulties. We treat everything that runs in the DSM, just about, except for probably antisocial personality disorder, because most people don't see those in the private setting. So outside of that, we pretty much deal with almost anything. I have had exposure response prevention training multiple times. And so I treat individuals that have OCD spectrum disorders, including body dysmorphia, trichotillomania, hair pulling, and skin picking, as well as, OCD. And me and Dr. Hansen, one of the psychologists here, will treat individuals with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is it's different than OCD, and it's a bit challenging, but it can be very rewarding once you get people to understand how their behavior is affecting their life. I mostly deal with adolescents and adults, but I do see kids as well, just not very many. I love doing a hierarchy. I think it's very rewarding and reinforcing for not only me, but for the individual to work on their anxiety and kind of getting them to push through it.
Right. So can you tell people a little bit about what a hierarchy is?
So part of exposure response prevention is you sit down with the individual and go through a list of everything that bothers them. I am always amazed, even though I know it's going to happen, but every single time I'm amazed with all of the depends. It depends. Well, what does it depend on? And so you all of those things out. So there's varying opinions on where you start. Personally, I'm not extreme. I don't just throw people in and do exposures. Usually the first 4 sessions are working on rapport building and building trust, so we can get to a place where they know that I'm not trying to hurt them. There are some other people that do exposure response prevention that do very traditional exposure response prevention that, from day one, okay, this bothers you, we're going to work on it. I've found that in this setting, it's not as advantageous just because people that are coming here haven't gone through other therapies that didn't work for OCD. People that go to centers that just treat OCD usually already know they have OCD and they've tried other things and they didn't work. So it's easier for you to just say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we're jumping right into it. But in this setting, I found that easing people into it is a little bit better, because often, even if they have OCD, they usually have some other issues that are interfering with their life. And so I kind of take a little bit of time to show them how changing can be beneficial. And we work on some of those easier issues like communication and with the younger kids, emotional recognition, just recognizing what you're feeling and labeling it can be very good for kids. And one of the funner things to do with some of the younger kids and sometimes with adults is we label their OCD. We give it a fun name. So when we talk about it like it's a person external from them, that has 2 benefits. One is it speeds up communication, because you're like, oh, that's just my OCD again. Like I see my OCD is interfering with this conversation or whatever. And it's fun to come up with ridiculous names for them. A lot of people like Harry Potter villains. I found that to be very...
Oh, okay.
But the other benefit is helping them understand that it is a external issue. It's not who they are as a person, and it helps them internalize that difficulty and also recognize that how it interferes with their life, but it's not them doing it to themselves. So it gives them a safe place to talk about some of their intrusive thoughts, because they can be very embarrassing. They can be very damaging to their family. I've had a client before that was afraid of accidentally assaulting his sisters, so he avoided them, and they didn't understand because they were younger. He had no desire to do those things, but he just had an intrusive thought about, what if I did that? And so he was mortified for saying that out loud. So when we gave him a space to talk about it and understand how intrusive thoughts aren't things that we want. We all have intrusive thoughts. It's just for people with OCD, some people say it's the sticky brain, but for people with OCD, those thoughts have a tendency to resonate a little longer, and they give them more value than you or I would. We would just have a thought and be like, oh, that's weird, whatever. And for people with OCD, they have a tendency to think about it, engage with it more, and then it leads to more anxiety. And then they have the developed behavior or some kind of a compulsive ritual to minimize, reduce, negate, whatever that intrusive thought. And so I found that I really do believe that not only engaging those intrusive thoughts, but also kind of playing them out. Like, okay, well, what would that look like if you did that? What would happen? Kind of going through those steps, doing some of the in vivo exposures can be really helpful in the beginning, so they see that you're not trying to hurt them. It's just you're trying to get them to understand that fear is controlling them.
Right. And I think it's important to point out that people who have OCD tend to be relatively intelligent, at least the ones that I've worked with, and they're aware enough to know that these thoughts are irrational and don't make sense to them. So then there tends to be some shame about getting stuck on this particular thought that I know makes no sense.
Well, there are varying levels of insight, and people that seek out therapy most often, especially adults, do have better insight. And I've found they come in saying things like, I feel crazy, I feel like I'm losing my mind, I feel like I'm out of control. They recognize that something is off, and they don't know what it is, but they know something's off. I've worked with people that have poorer insight. It is a bit more challenging because getting them to recognize that they have this thought, that doesn't mean that will actually happen, can be very difficult. But over time, I found bringing in family members and collateral support in those situations is very effective. But over time, when you start to get them to realize that what they think will happen isn't going to happen, they get better insight, they get faster at progressing through the treatment. I always tell people that treatment for OCD is teaching a counterfactual. It's teaching you that something you believe isn't true. And so that's really hard to teach somebody that what they think is going to happen isn't going to happen without putting them in that situation. So that's why we do a lot of activities, a lot of exposures. I've made jokes with clients about how, I mean it. I won't ask them to do anything that I wouldn't be willing to do myself. And so it doesn't matter if it's gross, it's not going to hurt me. But if there is something like, I haven't come across anything that I just like, nope, I'm not going to do that. But like all sorts of, dealing with different bodily fluids or things that look like bodily fluids and, eating things off of toilet seats, done it all. I've even had a client that, well, it doesn't count because it wasn't wet. So we licked it, stuck it on the toilet seat, and then ate a gummy bear. Didn't die, didn't get sick. I was like, this feels weird. Absolutely.
So you did that exposure with them? You ate the gummy bear off the toilet seat?
Yes.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm not going to do anything that I wouldn't ask them to do. I'm not going to ask them to do something that I'm like, oh no, that's disgusting, I won't do it. I've even played with animal poop. It's gross. I've been there, done that. It's like, okay, it smells bad. We sat with it and talked with it, and I'm like, okay, now we're going to wash our hands once. And that was the hard part of that exposure. We've gone to, had clients sometimes for social anxiety, or if clients have some OCD and have social anxiety, we use the exposure treatment as well for that. My favorite thing is we make an extremely difficult coffee list and we walk over to Dunkin' Donuts and they have to order it. First, I order it, and I order it really, really fast, and then they have to order it. And so the people at Dunkin' Donuts are extremely supportive. They see us coming. They've caught on. I've never told them what's going on, but they've caught on to what's going on. So they're very supportive over there, and they'll be patient with us, and we go through our little activity and we take a lot of deep breaths and do that. Depending on their age, I will encourage them to take deep breaths. When they're older, I won't prompt them to do any self-regulation activities. But some of the younger kids, if you don't do that, they'll just give up. So it is a preventative, don't give up, just take a deep breath. You've got this. Okay, go ahead. Kind of like spin them and send them out there.
I think what you're talking about really goes to having to have a great relationship with your therapist, like you said, so people know that I'm not trying to do something to hurt you. This is actually going to help you in the long run. What's painful in the short term will be helpful in the long run. But also this element of being able to be authentic, not asking clients to do anything that you wouldn't do. And it encourages people to stay engaged in the process because, quite frankly, it's hard sometimes. It's very hard. And ERP has a pretty high dropout rate.
Which is why, especially with younger clients, and I tell the parents, because I feel like for the parents, it's just as hard. So I will tell them early on that we'll do a hard week and then a soft week and then a hard week to get the kids going. Because if they think that it's always going to be hard, they start avoiding therapy. And I realized that early on. So like some of the fun sessions, the soft sessions, as I call them, are working on like emotional recognition. And we'll spend the whole hour processing the previous exposure, things like that, just to show them how well they did and kind of gassing them up and getting them ready for the next one. Because I feel like without that, they think I'm just evil and I'm mean and they don't want to come around. And I think in certain settings, somebody could do traditional exposure response prevention where it's gung-ho from hit the ground running and go. But I don't know that many people are tolerant of that. I try to, I've had some clients that come in and they're like, this is what I want to do. I'm like, all right, let's go. We can do it. But that's generally not what I've found, especially with younger children, because a lot of times you're also having to console and prevent the parents from using accommodations because they don't mean to, but they do. And so you have to help them recognize that this exposure is just as much for them to get used to it as it is for the kid. So.
Just to clarify for everyone that's listening, as far as titles and things like that go, because it's very easy to get confused when you're looking at counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and there's so many labels out there. So you work with psychologists, and psychologists are responsible for testing.
Well, not just testing.
But
the American Psychological Association has carved out that psychologists are the only ones allowed to do testing. In most settings, the way that it's actually set up is the certified psychological assistant just does the testing, and the psychologist actually is the one that interviews them, writes the reports, and does the feedbacks. We're a little different here. Plus, I have both of the licenses. I am allowed to do diagnosis because I am a licensed professional counselor with the mental health service provider designation. So my situation is a little bit different, but I will tell you that Tennessee and California are the only ones that really have certified psychological assistants. Most other states have what was here or is here as senior psych examiner. So other settings, if somebody's outside of Tennessee, they might see a counselor that can also do testing. That's just not the case here. I will tell you, most people, when they go and get their education, they specialize. And so even outside of Tennessee, most people do one or the other. It's very, very rare that they do both.
People tend to do testing or counseling. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, on the master's level, yes. Except psychologists, however, it depends on how they get their degree on what they focus on. You can get a clinical psychology degree, or you can get a counseling psychology degree. You can get a forensic one. There's lots of specialties, but it's up to them to ensure that they get the training and requirements to be able to perform those services. But ultimately, just being a psychologist in Tennessee gives them the access, permission to do psychological evaluations and to do counseling. Well, it's also important for people to understand that the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, because I feel like that's where a lot of people misunderstand. In Tennessee and in most other states, psychologists cannot write prescriptions. They are a PhD, not an MD. And for a psychiatrist, they can prescribe medication and they can do brief counseling services, but very few psychiatrists have the time to do that because there is a shortage of psychiatrists. So The last psychiatrist that I knew that actually sat down and did counseling, he since retired. So most of them maybe will do psychoeducation with a patient, but they don't actually do any of that counseling services like exposure response prevention. Usually that's left to the counselors or to a psychologist.
What do you think is the benefit of proper diagnosis? Because I think sometimes people are very hesitant to get a label, but if you're labeled with or diagnosed with anxiety and you actually have OCD, that can be detrimental to you.
Absolutely. I've seen counselors that had good intent trying to help a client, and they were unintentionally becoming an enabler for their OCD by accidentally giving them reassurance when they're reassurance seeking, or telling them that it's understandable that they have the irrational fears and things like that, which inadvertently reinforces the irrational beliefs. And so it makes it where it exacerbates the problem and it gets worse. They will, in that situation, often get addicted to their counselor. Not addicted in the sense of an addiction, but as a person that accommodates them, they will seek that person out to reassure them. And that can be very devastating when a counselor changes or things like that. And the fact that they're not going to get better, it's just shifting their compulsive behaviors. It's not change. It's not getting to the root of it. I often refer to OCD as a perennial disorder. It's one of those things that comes up and, goes away when they're not stressed out. It doesn't really go away. It just gets better. It's easier to tolerate. And so it kind of ebbs and flows with their stress level. And right. When somebody gets really stressed, they will get very entrenched in some of their compulsive behaviors. And if one of those compulsive behaviors is their counselor and seeking reassurance on a regular basis, they can be very hard on counselors with emails, phone calls, appointments in between. And it's not their fault. It's because that person makes them feel good for a second. And so they want that. They want to feel relief for a second. And that's the problem with the compulsions is they relieve the anxiety. They just kind of take the edge off, but all it does is increase the global level of the person's anxiety. So each time they do it, it just takes a little bit of the edge off, but the anxiety continues to grow. And so it kind of defeats the purpose. That's why it's beneficial to kind of get at the root of the intrusive thought and really address that than it is to address the compulsions. You just prevent them from doing the compulsions when you're doing the exposures.
Do you find that you have people who seek out psychological testing who have been in counseling a while and aren't getting better and are trying to figure out why?
Actually, more frequently, we see counselors sending people to us saying, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. Something is wrong here. Something isn't adding up. And they'll send them to us and we clarify the diagnosis and send them back. And that's very helpful for a lot of the counselors. I don't think that counselors have this, they're trained in making diagnosis, but some of the minute diagnoses are so intertwined. And it's possible that somebody has OCD and generalized anxiety. The likelihood of that is low, but it's possible. And so sometimes counselors will take diagnosis where somebody was hospitalized or a diagnosis from a doctor, things like that. And they're kind of following off of this assumption that that's accurate information. But they don't realize that in those other settings, somebody only saw them for a snapshot, usually when they're not in a good place. So it's not very accurate. And so doing psychological testing can be beneficial for even somebody that's just starting out in counseling. The reason it can be beneficial is it helps speed up the therapy process in that you don't fall into landmines. You don't fall into, why weren't we talking about this the whole time? It starts coming out in the evaluation. And so even if the client struggles to recognize some of the difficulties that they have, and we can't justify making a full diagnosis, we can still alert to there is an issue in this area, so then it can be addressed in counseling.
I know that in my experience, providing a proper diagnosis has been very relieving and helpful for clients who have been labeling themselves with other things such as I'm crazy or there's something really awfully wrong with me. And when you're able to say, okay, well, these symptoms line up with this diagnosis and it actually makes sense. And not only that, but there's hope because this is something that's treatable. We can help you with this. We can help you have a better life.
It's also making something that's very vague, very distinct, and it gives them a path that they can work on. And so it helps them see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I believe that doing the psychological evaluations really build buy-in with clients. You get more effort into changing their behavior if they know what you see and the way that you see it. They know what we think in that situation. They get to look at it in black and white just the way we do. And so we're working on the same thing. It's not like us, that old belief of the psychologist, or most people think of like the old Freudian psychoanalyst sitting back behind you on a couch and just taking notes about you and all that stuff. But what we're doing is I want it to be dynamic. I want it to be an interactive process. I'm here to help you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to guide you in what I think might be beneficial. I could be wrong. You need to tell me so we can discuss it. And so it's an exchange rather than a dictation.
That's good. I like that a lot. I would say that collaboration is really helpful for the things that we just talked about. We want people to come back. We want them to be involved and engaged, and we want this to be working for them. And so if something's not working, it's helpful for people to let us know that so we can shift gears a little bit.
And move the needle. I always say therapy isn't about getting you to the end really fast. It's about moving the needle. Every time we just want to move it a little bit more and a little bit more until one of the other things that testing does that makes it very helpful is that every client at some point plateaus. They'll start to plateau even though they've got more work to do. Having the psychological evaluation, you can go back and show them how far they've gone, how much they've grown. So this is where you were on this date. Look how far you've come. And then that gives them a little bit of that inertia to keep going, the push from the inertia. But so I think that is one of the things that's really beneficial for doing the evaluation. I do know that it can be time consuming because it takes time to get the authorization from the insurance company and those kinds of things. But I think the information that comes out of it is very relevant clinically. And it gives you kind of an approach. It gives you information on modalities that are more beneficial for that person. Instead of just kind of going in blindly and taking 6 weeks to figure that out, we can use that time, do the evaluation, and kind of move things forward.
So since this podcast is called Hope for Anxiety and OCD, I like to ask the guest at the end of our show to share a story of hope, which is a time where you've received hope from God or another person.
Well, I feel like I get hope every time somebody is successfully improving. Like I had a client that came in and he was convinced, he's a middle-aged man, convinced he was narcissistic. He was convinced he was a narcissist. And I'm like, really? You're like, really? And so in talking to him, it was really that he had OCD and he was just very entrenched in his compulsive behaviors. And so he would force them on other people. And so he thought that he must have been narcissistic to do that. And he successfully terminated treatment. We got to the end and he was doing great. And the last therapy session, I'm like, you still feel like a narcissist? No. And he got so much better about being able to talk about what was bothering him. It improved his marriage. It improved his work relationships. He had even gotten fired from a few jobs because of how his behavior was so ingrained. And that gave me a lot of hope. It gave me hope not only for my own child, but hope for my other clients that things can get better. You just have to keep working at it. It's a process. It's about the journey, not the sprint. You got to stay on it on the long haul. And it's about making sure that you're, like I said before, moving the needle. It's not about making anything happen quickly, because if it happens quick, it doesn't stick. So I really believe that. And I that's what gives me hope for clients, that it's about using behavioral techniques and efforts to help them understand their cognitions to change their behavior, which is the epitome of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always so exciting when people are at a a healthy level of coping where they feel they're in a good place to stop therapy. That's just a really exciting time for us. It's like, yay, let's celebrate and let's talk about how far you've come, and, call me if you need anything. But that's awesome.
I go as far as giving them a little certificate and telling them it's revocable at any time, so they can come back whenever they need to. But here's your little certificate. You've done all the hard work. You earned it. You earned your degree. Because it is hard. And if somebody trivializes that and doesn't take it as serious, you have a tendency to get people that drop out of counseling before, just because they think things are better. Better doesn't mean great. It just means better. And so we want to get things where they're moving in the right direction, and you're not likely to have any kind of relapse of it, because OCD is like, it's insidious. It is, and anxiety in general. They're both very ingrained in our world, and they're required for function of life. So if we just removed anxiety, that wouldn't be good for people either. So we have to get it to where they're back at a more normal responsive rate. And that's important, and it's kind of hard to do, but sometimes things can hit people really hard, and out of the blue, the world get turned upside down, and some of those old behaviors they can have spontaneous recovery of those old behaviors. And so teaching them the tools on how to deal with it, sometimes they can manage it on their own, sometimes they come back to therapy, but knowing that we're here is what's important for me. They know that they can come back at any time. We can talk about it. We can figure out what needs to happen. Because sometimes it's just, I have had a client come back after 3 or 4 years out of therapy, and it was due to they lost their wife. And so it was grief. And we're like, okay, this is grief. We can work through this. Absolutely. And they were afraid that it was going to cause their OCD to come back, but it was really just working through the grief. But at least they also felt very comforted in knowing that they had somewhere to go in that moment instead of having to start from the beginning, because the idea of that was overwhelming.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing with us your wisdom about a variety of topics. I think it was great.
You're welcome.
I just want to say that if you've been in therapy for a pretty good chunk of time and you haven't been able to see improvements, it's really an opportunity for you and your therapist to sit down and evaluate why that is, because there may be several different reasons that you're not getting better. It may be a situation where you're having a hard time integrating what you're learning and practicing it at home. It may be a situation where what you're trying to receive from your therapist, they might not have as much training on, or it may be that their approach might not be working for you. So when Jessica's talking about moving the needle, if you're in therapy and you don't feel like your needle is moving, it's really important for you to evaluate why. Definitely get the help that you need. And if you're stumped and your therapist is stumped, then psychological testing may be the next best step for you. I hope that sharing this information will really help someone get what they need. If you really like the show and you find the content valuable, will you do me a huge favor? Will you go on your favorite podcast platform and review us? I would appreciate that so much. Reviews really give a personal firsthand account of what people can expect from our show. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling in Smyrna, Tennessee. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum, and audio editing was completed by Benjamin Bynum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.